The first sound was not the explosion, but the sudden whine. It sliced through the usual chaos of rotor blades and radio chatter, a pitch so unnatural that Captain Riley's blood turned cold before her brain caught up. The Black Hawk shuddered violently, lurching as if some invisible giant had grabbed the tail. Sparks showered the dark sky, falling like orange rain over the jungle canopy below. For a second, her co-pilot cursed, hands flying over the controls, but Riley already knew what had happened. "Tail rotor's gone," she shouted, voice cutting through the intercom. The Black Hawk began to spin, at first slowly, then faster, a dizzying spiral as tracer rounds streaked past the windows. The squad in the back, a team of exhausted soldiers they'd been tasked to extract, grabbed onto straps, helmets slamming against the metal interior as the aircraft tilted wildly. "Hold on," Riley barked, her voice a razor against the panic swelling inside the helicopter. This was supposed to be routine, exfil under cover of night, but the enemy had been waiting with a shoulder-fired missile. They'd fired from the jungle shadows, just as she cleared the ridgeline, and now her Black Hawk, her bird, was bleeding out in midair. The smell of burning oil filled the cockpit, acrid and choking. Warning alarm screamed. A red light blinked on her panel, hydraulic failure. She trained for emergencies, drilled every scenario, but every handbook ended the same. Land immediately. That wasn't an option. Not here. Not with hostiles below, waiting to finish them. "Captain, what do we do?" Her co-pilot Alvarez shouted, sweat dripping down his temple. His hands trembled as he fought the controls. Riley's jaw clenched. She saw the soldiers in the back, faces pale, eyes wide. They were counting on her. If she froze, they'd all die spinning into jungle fire. Her voice came steady, almost cold. "We fight the bird. We don't let go." She tightened her grip on the cyclic, feeling every violent shake through the frame. She pushed, pulled, counted the death spiral as best she could. Alvarez copied, following her lead. For 7 eternal seconds, the helicopter spun like a drunk top, the horizon blurring in wild streaks of green and black. Then Riley found it, the angle, the resistance point in the wind's invisible hand. She leaned the cyclic hard, praying the battered rotors obeyed. The spin slowed. The Black Hawk jerked, yawing violently, but steadied barely. "We've got partial control," she hissed, breathing hard. "But we're going down. Control descent only." Bullets rattled against the fuselage. The soldiers shouted over the roar. Riley's headset buzzed with overlapping voices from command, but she tuned them out. She didn't need orders. She needed a landing zone. Below them stretched endless jungle, no clearing in sight, just black canopy and death waiting. Her eyes scanned, heart pounding. Then she saw it, an old riverbed, a sliver of open ground glinting under moonlight. Narrow, unforgiving, but better than trees. She pointed. "There, riverbed. That's our strip." Alvarez swore. "That's suicide." Her grip never loosened. "So is falling out of the sky. We're going there." The Black Hawk screamed as if in pain, metal grinding, rotors fighting to hold their spin. Riley felt every vibration through her bones, but her face stayed set like stone. She was not going to let her people die tonight, not while her hands were still on the stick. The descent was not graceful. It was survival carved out of chaos. The Black Hawk tilted nose forward, engines howling as Riley forced it toward the narrow stretch of riverbed. Every correction felt like wrestling a beast, a dying one that wanted to drag her and everyone inside down with it. "Brace for impact." Alvarez shouted to the back. The soldiers clung tighter to their harnesses, knuckles white. Someone began muttering a prayer. Tracer fire continued from the jungle, sparks bursting off the helicopter sides, but Riley blocked it out. The enemy didn't matter. The ground did. She guided the bird lower, watching the treetops rise to meet them. The riverbed loomed closer, narrower than it had looked from above. She needed precision. A single miscalculation, and the rotors would shear against the trees, turning them into shrapnel. "Easy, easy," she whispered, her voice more to herself than anyone else. The helicopter shuddered again. A warning light flashed. Fuel leak. The smell grew stronger, making her eyes sting. Alvarez coughed. She's not going to hold together. Riley's jaw locked. Then we hold her together. She thought of every hour she had ever spent in simulators. Every emergency drill where instructors barked commands from behind glass. None of them had mattered, not like this. This was the razor line between life and death. Her mind slowed. Her hands moved faster. Each adjustment of the cyclic, each tap of the pedals, everything became instinct, a dialogue between woman and machine. The rotors clipped a treetop. The whole bird lurched. Gasps and curses filled the back. Riley steadied, sweat pouring down her back. Almost there. The riverbed opened below, moonlight reflecting faintly off wet sand. She lowered the collective, trying to bleed speed, but the bird dropped too fast. Too steep. Alvarez yelled. Not if we ride it in. Riley snapped. She pulled hard, nose up. The tail dragged, sparks flying as metal scraped dirt. The Black Hawk slammed down, skidding across the riverbed in a spray of mud and sand. The world turned into a blur of impact, soldiers thrown against restraints, the cockpit rattling so violently Riley thought her teeth would shatter. Then silence. The Black Hawk sat mangled, tilted to one side, smoke rising from the ruined tail. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then coughing groans, voices. I'm okay. I'm hit but alive. Alive. Riley's hands still gripped the cyclic, knuckles white. Her chest rose and fell, shallow, rapid. She blinked, realized Alvarez was staring at her in disbelief. You landed it. He breathed. Riley swallowed, throat raw. She didn't answer. She just unclipped her harness, her body trembling with the adrenaline crash. The mission wasn't over. The jungle still surrounded them. The enemy would be closing in, hungry to finish what their missile had started. But for now, just for now, her bird had carried them down alive. And that was enough. The smell of burning fuel clung thick in the air, mingling with the humid jungle heat. Riley stumbled out of the cockpit, boots sinking into the wet riverbed sand. Her helmet was cracked along the edge, and her ribs ached from the harness, biting into her chest during impact. But she was still standing. That counted. Everyone out. Move, move, she barked, her voice hoarse but commanding. The soldiers scrambled from the back of the Black Hawk, some limping, some dragging each other. Alvarez stumbled out behind her, holding his side where blood had begun to seep through his flight suit. One of the infantrymen, Corporal Denton, looked around wildly, clutching his rifle. Captain, we're sitting ducks out here. They'll be on us any minute. Riley ignored the panic and scanned the perimeter. The treeline loomed like jagged teeth, shadows too thick, too quiet. The enemy was out there, watching, waiting. We form a perimeter, she ordered. Denton, Harris, up on the north line. Jackson, cover east. Alvarez, with me, we secure the bird. Nobody wanders, nobody panics. Her words cut through the chaos, snapping the men into action. Fear was still on their faces, but discipline was stronger. They spread out, weapons leveled toward the jungle. Riley ducked back into the Black Hawk, yanking open a supply crate. Inside, flares, med kits, and, thank God, an M240 machine gun with a belt of ammo. She slung it over her shoulder and dragged it outside, setting it up to cover the riverbed approach. Alvarez leaned against the wreck, pale but focused. Radios fried. We're cut off. Riley's stomach sank. Command had no idea they were alive. No rescue bird was coming, not unless they made it through the night. A sharp whistle split the air. A second later, gunfire erupted from the treeline. Contact. East. Jackson shouted, firing bursts into the shadows. Bullets tore through the air, sparking against the Black Hawk's frame. One round pinged off Riley's helmet, ringing her ears. She dropped flat, bracing the machine gun on the sand, and let loose a storm of fire. The M240's roar cut into the jungle, muzzle flash lighting her determined face. Branches snapped, bodies fell. But more shadows kept moving, closing in. "Hold the line," Riley shouted, her voice steady as stone. The firefight became a blur. Yells, flashes, the smell of cordite. Riley's world shrank to her trigger, her aim, her men's voices. She didn't think about fear, or about the wreck smoldering behind her. She thought only about survival. Minutes dragged like hours. Finally, the gunfire thinned. The jungle went silent again, except for the groans of the wounded and the distant hiss of burning metal. Riley reloaded, scanning the tree line. "They're probing us. Testing. They'll be back." Her men looked at her with a mixture of exhaustion and awe. In the span of an hour, she had kept them alive twice, once in the air, and now on the ground. Alvarez sank against the Blackhawk's side, grimacing. "So what's the plan, Captain?" "Sit here and wait to die." Riley looked at the ruined helicopter, then at the river winding away into the dark jungle. She exhaled slowly, the weight of command heavy on her shoulders. "No," she said firmly. "We're not dying here. We hold until dawn. Then we move." And as the men adjusted their positions, whispering prayers into the night, Riley sat behind a machine gun, eyes never leaving the jungle. Because she knew they'd come again. And next time, it would be harder. The jungle was never quiet, but tonight every sound felt like a threat. Cicadas hummed, owls screeched, and branches rustled in the damp breeze. Each noise made the soldiers flinch, fingers tightening on their triggers. They were bone-tired, drenched in sweat, and every shadow felt alive. Riley crouched near the Blackhawk's ruined hull, her machine gun resting across her lap. Her eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion, but she refused to let them close. If she slept, even for a second, they'd all be gone. She checked her watch. 0200 hours. For more hours until first light. For hours of hell. "Captain!" Alvarez's voice was weak. He was slumped nearby, clutching his side. Blood had soaked through his bandage. If I don't make it." "Shut up," Riley said sharply, not looking at him. He managed a pained smile. "You always know what to say." Her throat tightened, but she kept her eyes forward. "You're making it. End of discussion." A twig snapped. Riley froze. Her fingers slid to the trigger. She signaled with a hand, quiet, still. The soldiers held their breath. Another snap. Then movement, shadows weaving between trees. "Positions," Riley hissed. The jungle exploded with gunfire. Muzzles flared like lightning, cutting brief snapshots into the night. Enemy silhouettes rushing forward, her own men firing desperately from cover. The crash site turned into a storm of bullets, sparks dancing off the Blackhawk's broken shell. Riley swung her machine gun, laying down, suppressing fire. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she didn't stop. Each burst cut holes in the darkness, tearing down advancing figures. Denton screamed, hit in the arm. Harris dragged him back, blood slicking his sleeve. Alvarez fired a sidearm until the slide locked back, then slumped again, barely conscious. Riley's jaw clenched. She couldn't let them overrun. If the line broke, everyone died. She shifted position, pulling the machine gun higher, and fired in controlled bursts. Her voice cut through the chaos. "Hold the line. Don't give them an inch." Minutes stretched like eternity. The ground shook with each burst of gunfire. Riley lost count of how many she dropped, 5, 10 more. Her arms burned. Sweat stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. Finally, the jungle went still. Silence fell, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the hiss of cooling barrels. The men looked at her, breathless, their faces pale in the moonlight. Did we hold?" Jackson asked, voice trembling. Riley scanned the tree line. No movement. No return fire. Just silence. "For now," she said, her voice like iron. But inside, her chest ached. She knew the truth. The enemy wasn't done. They'd circle, regroup, and come again stronger. She glanced at Alvarez, unconscious now, his breathing shallow. Then at Denton, his arm wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. She was running out of time. out of ammo, out of options. But surrender wasn't in her vocabulary. Not tonight. She looked at the horizon, dark but softening with the faintest hint of dawn. Just a few more hours, she whispered to herself. We make it to dawn. And with that, she set her jaw, reloaded her weapon, and prepared to face whatever the jungle was about to throw at them next. Because if death was coming, it would have to get through her first. Dawn crept into the jungle like a hesitant intruder. The sky was still bruised with the fading night, but the first threads of sunlight began weaving through the canopy. Riley's eyes burned from sleeplessness. She hadn't blinked for more than a second in hours. Her hands were blackened from gunpowder, her uniform soaked with sweat and dirt. But she was still standing. She had to be. The survivors huddled close to the wreck. Denton, his arm bandaged, cradled his rifle in his good hand. Jackson's face was pale, his lips cracked from thirst. Alvarez hadn't stirred in hours, his shallow breaths the only sign he was still alive. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't peace. It was a pause, a false lull. Riley crouched and spread a rough sketch in the dirt with a stick. A crude map. The river to the west, the ridges to the north. Listen up, she whispered. We can't hold here. Ammo's almost gone, and they know where we are. We head for the river. If we follow it south, there's a chance, just a chance, we'll hit friendlies or a village with a radio. Denton looked at her with wide eyes. Ma'am, Alvarez can't move. He's barely holding on. Riley's jaw tightened. She looked at Alvarez, pale and still. Her chest ached, but she shook her head. Then we carry him. We don't leave our own. No one argued. Even exhausted, even half-broken, they nodded. Because that was what Riley had drilled into them. What she lived by. Never leave anyone behind. They stripped what they could from the Blackhawk, canteens, a few rations, a box of ammo dented from the crash. Riley slung Alvarez over her shoulder, her muscles screaming with every step, but she didn't flinch. Move, she ordered, her voice steady, masking the fire burning in her ribs. They slipped into the jungle, leaving the wreck smoldering in the clearing behind them. For an hour, they pushed south along the riverbank, boots sinking in mud, rifles at the ready. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat, thick and merciless. Every breath felt like sucking air through wet cloth. Then, just as they reached a bend in the river, the jungle erupted. Gunfire cracked from the tree-line. Bullets tore into the mud around them, water splashing as rounds hit the river. Jackson went down with a cry, clutching his leg. Ambush! Denton shouted, dropping to his belly and firing back. Riley dragged Alvarez behind a fallen log, setting him down gently before swinging her rifle up. She sighted the muzzle flashes and fired in controlled bursts, each shot precise despite her exhaustion. Enemy figures emerged from the trees, dark uniforms, rifles glinting in the sunlight. Dozens of them. We can't stay pinned. Riley shouted. She scanned the river. The current was fast, but not deadly. It was their only chance. Into the water, she ordered. Denton hesitated. Captain, they'll gun us down. Do it, she barked, her voice cutting like steel. Without another word, she grabbed Alvarez again and plunged into the river. Cold water surged around her chest, dragging her down. She kicked hard, pushing Alvarez onto his back to keep his face above water. Denton followed, half carrying Jackson as bullets whipped the surface around them. The river became a gauntlet of lead, each splash a near miss. Riley's arms burned as she fought the current, dragging Alvarez with every ounce of strength she had left. Her lungs screamed for air, her ribs stabbed with each stroke, but she didn't let go. Finally, the current swept them around the bend, out of the enemy's line of fire. They clung to the far bank, gasping for breath, mud clinging to their uniforms. Denton collapsed beside her, coughing water. Jackson groaned, his leg bleeding heavily. Alvarez lay motionless, but his chest still rose and fell faintly. Riley pressed her forehead against the mud, her whole body trembling. They were alive, but barely. She lifted her head, eyes hard. "We keep moving," she said hoarsely. "We're not done yet." And as the jungle swallowed them again, she knew the fight was only just beginning. The jungle was merciless. By midday, the heat pressed down like a weight, and every step through the underbrush felt like walking with chains. The survivors staggered in silence, too drained to speak. Jackson leaned heavily on Denton, his wounded legs slowing them to a crawl. Riley carried Alvarez across her shoulders, his weight a constant reminder of the thin line between life and death. But the silence didn't last. Somewhere behind them, faint at first, then sharper, the crack of branches. Footsteps. Voices. "They're tracking us," Riley whispered, her stomach sinking. Denton's face was pale with fear. "How many?" "Too many," she said grimly. "They want us alive. Or dead. Doesn't matter." The enemy wasn't rushing them now. No reckless charge. They were hurting them, like wolves driving prey into a trap. Riley's mind raced. They couldn't outrun them, not with Alvarez unconscious and Jackson barely moving. The only option was to turn the hunt back on the hunters. She pulled Denton aside. "We set an ambush. Here." He looked around at the patch of jungle. Dense vines, thick roots, uneven ground. "We've got barely any ammo." "Then we make it count," Riley said sharply. "We hit them first. Hard. Scare them into thinking there are more of us." Denton swallowed hard, then nodded. They moved fast, setting what traps they could with what little they had. Tripwires from parachute cords, grenades tied to branches, firing positions dug into the mud. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Riley dragged Alvarez into cover behind a thick tree, then took up her own position with her rifle braced on a root. She checked the chamber. Half a mag left. Enough to make them bleed. Minutes stretched. The jungle grew quiet again, unnaturally so. Then the first enemy appeared. A dark shape moving through the vines, rifle raised. Another followed. Then another. Riley's finger tightened on the trigger. She waited until they were deep into the kill zone, then whispered, "Now." The jungle erupted. Grenades exploded overhead, branches snapping, dirt flying. Denton fired from the flank, cutting down 2 men before ducking back into cover. Riley's rifle cracked again and again, each shot precise, controlled. The enemy shouted in panic, some firing wildly, others retreating. For a moment, just a moment, it worked. The net broke. The hunters stumbled. But then came the counter. Gunfire ripped back into the jungle. Bullets shredded leaves, splinters flying. One round grazed Riley's arm, hot blood running down her sleeve. Denton screamed, his cover collapsing under fire. Riley gritted her teeth, firing until her rifle clicked empty. She dropped it, yanked out her sidearm, and kept fighting. The jungle became chaos, shouts, explosions, smoke. Her trap slowed them. Her ambush wounded them. But still they came. Dozens, maybe more. Riley dragged Denton back toward Alvarez and Jackson, her mind racing. She couldn't hold them. Not forever. She looked at her men, their faces pale, their bodies broken, and then at the advancing shadows. It was clear. The net had closed. But she wasn't going down without making them pay for every inch. Riley tightened her grip on her pistol, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Come and take us," she whispered, her voice steady as steel. And as the enemy closed in, the jungle prepared to swallow the last stand of a pilot who refused to bow. The jungle smelled of blood and cordite. Smoke drifted low to the ground, clinging to the leaves and roots like a blanket. Riley's chest heaved as she pressed her back against a tree, her pistol hot in her hand. She could hear them shuffling, shouting in clipped bursts of a foreign tongue. The enemy was tightening the noose. Denton lay slumped beside Alvarez, clutching his side. He'd taken shrapnel, and his uniform was soaked with crimson. His breaths came shallow, but his eyes still burned with determination. Jackson, pale from blood loss, was propped against a root, his rifle balanced across his lap even though his leg trembled from the pain. "Captain," Denton whispered hoarsely, You should go. Leave us. You can still make it if you move now." Riley turned her head sharply, her eyes flashing. "Shut your mouth, Sergeant. Nobody's getting left behind. Not on my watch." He gave her a faint smile, as if he'd expected her to say that. She checked her sidearm. Half a mag. That was all she had left. Her rifle lay empty in the mud, the barrel scorched from the last desperate stand. The jungle fell quiet again. Too quiet. Then, snap. A twig broke somewhere to the left. Riley raised her pistol. She exhaled slowly. And then she fired. The first enemy soldier dropped into the mud. Another appeared behind him, firing wildly, and Riley ducked as bullets tore bark from the tree. She fired again, the shot cracking through the foliage. From the right flank, another burst of gunfire roared. Denton, bleeding heavily, had propped his rifle against a rock and fired into the shadows. His shots were slow, deliberate, but each one found a target. "Come on," he shouted hoarsely. "You want us? Then come get us." For a moment, the small patch of jungle became a killing ground. Riley and Denton's defiance held the enemy at bay, their precision and fury making the attackers believe they faced more than two half-broken survivors. But the enemy adapted. They spread out, creeping through the foliage, trying to flank. Jackson, pale and weak, suddenly raised his rifle. His shot cracked, and one of the advancing soldiers dropped. "Not today," he muttered through clenched teeth. Riley felt pride burn in her chest. Her men were wounded, battered, half dead, but they were still soldiers. They refused to bow. Then the grenades came. The enemy hurled them blindly, small black shapes tumbling through the air. Riley's instinct screamed. She dove, grabbing Alvarez and dragging him deeper behind cover. The blasts ripped through the clearing, shaking the ground, sending dirt and leaves raining down. Denton cried out, his body jerking under the shockwave. Riley scrambled back, pulling him to safety. His face was pale, his uniform shredded. "Stay with me," she shouted, pressing her hand against his wound. Denton coughed, blood staining his lips. His eyes locked on hers. "Captain, don't waste yourself for me." Riley's throat tightened, but she refused to look away. "I told you we all go home. You hear me? All of us." But even as she said it, the enemy pushed closer. Shadows darted between trees, rifles raised. They were closing in, step by step, and Riley knew they couldn't hold much longer. Her hand brushed against the last grenade strapped to her vest. She looked at it, then at the enemy advancing, and a grim resolve settled over her. If they wanted her team, they'd have to pay. She pulled the pin, waited for the right moment, and hurled it into the densest cluster of soldiers. The explosion tore through the jungle, screams echoing as the survivors scattered. "Move!" she shouted to her men. "We use the gap. Crawl now." Jackson dragged himself forward, gritting his teeth against the pain. Denton pushed with one arm, his rifle clutched in the other. Riley lifted Alvarez again, her body screaming in protest. They crawled through the mud, inch by inch, as gunfire cracked behind them. And then a sound, distant, faint, but unmistakable. The chop of helicopter blades. Riley froze, her heart pounding. She lifted her head, straining to hear. Yes, rotors. Low and steady. She grabbed her flare from her vest, the last one she had, and snapped it to life. Red smoke hissed into the sky, drifting above the canopy. "Over here!" she screamed, her voice raw, praying the sound carried. "Over here!" Gunfire answered. The enemy had seen the flare too. They pushed harder, determined to finish the hunt before rescue could arrive. Riley's men dug in, firing their last rounds to hold the line. Jackson's rifle clicked empty, and he drew his sidearm. Denton coughed blood, but still fired one-handed into the trees. And Riley stood, flare in one hand, pistol in the other, defiant against the tide. The helicopter grew louder, but would it be in time? The jungle erupted into chaos. A roar split the air as the helicopter broke through the canopy, its rotors whipping leaves into a frenzy. The gunner leaned out, a heavy machine gun spitting fire into the treeline. Enemy soldiers screamed as the rounds chewed through their positions. Riley felt hope surge through her chest, hot and fierce. Hold on. They've got us. She fired her last bullets into the shadows, covering the gunner's sweep, then dropped her empty pistol into the mud. She hoisted Alvarez higher onto her shoulders and waved the flare desperately. The helicopter descended, skids brushing the treetops. A rope dropped from the side, swaying wildly. Go! Riley shouted to her men. Jackson pushed forward, grabbing the rope with trembling hands. Denton followed, gritting his teeth against the pain, climbing with sheer willpower. The crew above pulled them up, their bodies swinging against the side of the chopper. Riley staggered to the rope with Alvarez still slung across her shoulders. Her arms burned, her legs shook, but she forced herself to lift him, hooking his limp arms around the rope. Take him first, she screamed. Hands reached down, pulling Alvarez into the safety of the cabin. The enemy fired relentlessly now, bullets whipping past, some striking sparks off the helicopter's frame. The gunner roared back, unleashing a storm of lead. Riley grabbed the rope next. Her body was at its breaking point, every muscle screaming, but she climbed anyway, hand over hand, teeth clenched against the agony. Then, a searing pain ripped through her shoulder. A bullet. She cried out, her grip loosening, but she refused to fall. With a primal scream, she pulled herself higher, blood dripping onto the mud below. Hands caught her wrists. Strong calloused. We've got you, Captain. Hold on. With one last heave, they hauled her into the cabin. She collapsed onto the floor, gasping, blood soaking her sleeve. Around her, Jackson and Denton were strapped in, pale but alive. Alvarez lay unconscious, medics working furiously. The helicopter lifted higher, the jungle shrinking below. The enemy fired upward in frustration, but their bullets couldn't reach. The crew cheered as the jungle finally fell away beneath them. Riley rolled onto her back, staring at the ceiling of the chopper, her chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. For the first time since the crash, she allowed herself to close her eyes. They were alive. Against all odds, they had made it. Jackson leaned over, his voice hoarse but steady. Captain, we wouldn't have made it without you. Riley's lips curved into a faint smile. We made it because we never gave up. That's all that matters. The helicopter banked south, carrying them toward safety, toward another day of war, another fight. But in that moment, cradled by the sky's embrace, they were more than soldiers. They were survivors, and Riley knew that as long as she drew breath, she would carry the weight of her squad, their pain, their courage, their unbreakable will. The jungle had tried to swallow them whole, but they had clawed their way back into the light, and that, Riley thought as she finally let sleep take her, was victory enough.